Welcome to the Agents Angle, where today we will metaphorically be donning recognisable yellow and green jerseys, blue shorts and white socks.
Yes, today we are focusing primarily on the homeland of the likes of Pelé, Neymar, Cafu and many others. Yes, Brazil. And our guest today has worked and continues to work with many Brazilian internationals, past, present and future.
And whilst we're focusing on one country so synonymous with football, we will also be looking at the latest agent commission reports from another, and arguably the most lucrative league in the world.
All that to come with me, Peter Paleologos.
And me, Jonathan Booker.
On this episode of The Agents Angle.
Yes, everyone, welcome to another packed episode of The Agents Angle, our 60th scheduled and normal episode. With so much going on in the agents world at the moment, realistically, we can't fit it all in. And that's not even with quick takes being published as well, if only to cover off the other stories from the world of football agency that don't make it onto the podcast itself. And just as a side note, before we get started on this episode, it is being recorded just over a week in advance. That is before my Antipodean colleague starts his travels and a few weeks traversing Europe. And I also find myself on the road, but to far less far-flung or glamorous locations. So please don't think we haven't kept up to date or taken our foot off the gas when this episode goes live.
Yes, Jonathan, we've had a flurry of interviews recently and wanted to ensure we cover the USA and also Brazil to get the right agency-minded guests. It takes a lot of planning, a lot of research, a lot of scheduling, as you said. And although the football agency world may be a niche area, there's always plenty of development, stories, as you say, and an intersection of the new trends in the industry, which we always want to cover on our podcast. Let's just think analytics, data, significant court cases, player deals, transfer windows, a lot to discuss. I can't fit it all in, Jonathan.
But even with so much to discuss in this episode of The Agents Angle, we're going to try and keep our own contributions relatively short. And the reason for that is we have a thoroughly enlightening interview coming up with a guest from Brazil, where football is arguably not so much a sport, but it's probably more appropriately referred to as almost a religion. And as such, we want to devote a large proportion of the time with this episode to that interview. But we do sift through a lot of agent-related stories and resources throughout the week to make sure we get the right content for you. And one of the techniques I use in filtering stories and topics is when the agent involved is unlicensed or unregistered, because I rarely want to give the stories such oxygen, and definitely not associate them with licensed agents who've gone to the effort to get a license, be registered, and are subject to the regulations. As such, the re-emergence of the FIFA agent register in recent weeks has been a great help and a time saver in that respect. However, without looking a gift horse in the mouth, so to speak, and criticising FIFA too much on something that we welcome, although never should have been removed in the first place, I have noted a few bugs in the FIFA licensed agent register. The most dominant one being that if you enter the full name of the agent, sometimes the agent doesn't come up as listed or registered. But if you enter just their first name or just their family name, they more than likely will be displayed if registered. Although you may have to sift through a few listings that share the same name. So just be careful with that, everyone, when checking on the status of other agents. But the strange thing is that although referred to on the FIFA public site, the agent register is seemingly locked away within the agent platform, so seemingly not available publicly. And if the likes of players, their families, or the likes of the media want to check on an agent's license status, they seemingly can't at the moment. But I'm guessing that clubs can get access, as the register is more than likely accessible and integrated through TMS. Yet for me, two clear and pretty basic oversights there, I think, with the welcome return of the agent's register. Maybe there's a reasoning for this. But if it is an oversight, hopefully by the time this episode goes live, as I've already said, we're recording quite a bit in advance of release, FIFA will have sorted out that bug along with any others that may exist.
That's very true, Jonathan. I mean, a surname like mine, I don't think you would go missing. But obviously, if you put a first name or surnames where there's a lot of different agents with similar surnames, it is in the sense of a bug system. So there's always gremlins, as we call it in Australia, with IT systems. But I agree with you. I'm happy that it's come on board again, especially because I've been getting a lot of referrals about unlicensed agents and therefore can check that out. But also, I'm a little bit concerned about the FAWG. They should be sending out to their stakeholders that this has come on board. What are the improvements? So the FIFA agent working group should be more active here and disseminating this information about what's happening with the directory. And it's not just FIFA's role to make a confederation, agents in different confederations or countries and things like that, and how it's going to be improved. So I don't think it's just a FIFA thing. I think the FIFA agents group has to be more proactive in disseminating information, in particular about systems like this, Jonathan.
But that aside, there have been two key developments in recent days that have or will have a huge impact on agents. One is in relation to the publication of agent commissions, which we'll come back to later in the show. But the other is in relation to news that came out just a couple of days ago in relation to the show's old friend, the FFAR, and subsequently the ECJ, or European Court of Justice, to give it its full title.
Yes, recent news over the last day or two that the Advocate General opinion that's going to be made at the European Court of Justice, ECJ, on the FFAR cases that were referred by the German courts. So we're talking about the German cases. That decision has been delayed by 1 week. So it was supposed to come out on the 8th of May. However, it's coming out on the 15th of May, 2025. It's only a week. It may be because it's a complex matter and there's questions of EU law, but also German law, and that there's other cases that intersect with this matter, how they're going to be interrelated with this matter or referred to in the decision. Could also be the workload of the Advocate General staff. There's a lot of work. I had a look at the list of public-sized decisions, a lot of decisions. That's maybe another reason for the delay. And also checks and balances. You've got to get the decision right. You've got to disseminate the decision. And in order to cross-check this, because we do like to check our sources, we checked the ECJ website to see the new dates, and that was confirmed 15th of May. But also we contact one of the agents closely linked with the action that was taken, the German agencies who took action, to confirm there'll be a week delay.
Needless to say, this has thrown a bit of a spanner in the work with regards to our scheduling for the rest of the season of the show. But joking aside, we can't stress how important the publication of the AG's opinion is. And despite now seemingly having to wait an additional week, that doesn't seem too much to ask because everyone has been waiting for what is several years for anything close to a resolution on this matter of FFAR. We've seen multiple cases and rulings around the world on the matter, and we've been talking about it on the show for ages. In fact, I'm getting pretty sick of it, but it impacts so many people. And without meaning to sound Eurocentric or a bit arrogant, because I understand the importance of other markets in what is truly a world game and an international business, but this is arguably the big one that will probably have ramifications elsewhere in the world of football, not just Europe. But even then, this isn't technically the end of the matter. Yes, the AG's opinion usually demonstrates how the final ruling will go, but that's not guaranteed. And then, of course, we have to wait to see what the referring court in Germany does, and also see what FIFA can or is willing to do. Personally, I'm not going to read too much into the delay. As you said, Peter, it is just a week and these things happen. Everyone in professional roles have to contend with delays and timelines being moved. It's far too easy to presume something has happened, something has changed, or it is a close call in the case itself. And some people in the agents world are trying to hedge their bets a little bit by saying that they sat in the hearing, heard the evidence, and don't think the agents' pleadings are as resounding as we would like to think. And maybe the agents should prepare for a negative outcome. But my take on this, we've waited long enough already. Another week isn't going to make that much difference, and it may be nothing to do with the case. And subsequently, the publication of the opinion has just been delayed.
Yes, I think a week is not much. Interesting what you say about people being in the court case in the room. what came out of that, and we mentioned this, the judges asked a lot of questions, which is a good thing because you need to get to the bottom of what both parties or submissions. Now, you've got to get the decision right. And as you say, the ECJ can also go against the Advocate General's decision if they want to. But the key is here, if it is negative for FIFA, they produce a framework where they give the German courts guidance to implement the EU policy that applies not just to agent fees, but there's other matters that have been raised in these challenges. I don't want to speculate. It's going to be intriguing. And I'm sure when the time comes, we'll get the right specialist, we always do, in order to unpack a very interesting decision, which will have, as you say, a huge impact on the agent industry, not just in Europe, because whatever happens in Europe, FIFA will have to implement it worldwide. Watch your space.
But as I said, I don't think anyone affected by this case can underestimate how big this opinion is. As although it is just an opinion and not a ruling, it should trigger a response either from FIFA, the agents, or maybe even others over FFAR. But one country where it could be argued that any final ruling on FFAR by the ECJ may not have a direct impact, either due to geography, jurisdiction, or the fact courts there have already ruled on the matter of FFAR, is Brazil.
Yes, one of our most intriguing markets, Brazil. And we mentioned this, there was a court case in Brazil in relation to the FFAR's implementation. We've been meaning to have a Brazilian episode or a Brazilian specific agent football lawyer on one of the episodes. And I believe our guest today has been worth waiting for. Today, I wish to welcome our esteemed guest to the podcast, namely Luis Fernando Pamplona Novaes. Luis is a Brazilian sports lawyer and a partner at Nemetz, Kuhnen, Delmarco, and Pamplona Novaes, known worldwide as NKDPN, with offices in Brazil and Spain. He specializes in sports taxation as well as being the co-founder of N29 Football Agency, who have player clients in the likes of the Bundesliga and the English Premier League. Luis has worked with many players from the Brazilian national team, including Thiago Silva, as a client throughout his career from PSG, Chelsea, and then back to Fluminense. Luis speaks Portuguese, Spanish, and English, three of the seminal languages required in the international football industry. Luis is a dedicated attorney not only to athletes, but also agents, clubs, and investors in international football, as well as had forays into world volleyball and basketball. His involvement with sports does not stop at the advisory field. He's also the co-academic director of one of the most important and most recognized MBA in sports laws in the world, and one from ISDE in Madrid. He's also a guest lecturer at the University of Miami, Halftime Academy of Japan, and the University of Sorbonne in France and their India program. Luis, welcome to the Agents Angle.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Peter and Jonathan. It's a big pleasure. And yes, it's always a pleasure to talk about agency and all related issues.
Thank you. Luis, how would you describe the current structure of the football agent industry in Brazil? Is it fragmented, consolidated, or evolving year by year?
Well, first of all, it's important to highlight that, as probably most of our listeners know, Brazil is a big market. So we have different realities in different divisions, in different levels. On a top level, we can say that it is a very consolidated market. And I say this, it's not my opinion. The numbers can help us understanding this, just for your comprehension. Out of all players playing the Brazilian First Division, more than 140 players are controlled by 10 main agencies or agents. So these main agencies or agents, they control the market on a top level. Of course, that if we go to lower divisions and if we go into the academy level, then we have a slightly different reality. But it is a very consolidated market. Another aspect that it is important for us to understand that out of the players in the first division, only 9 players are self-represented and only 9 players are represented by family members. So there's no much room. For example, if you are a new agent or a new player in this market and you're trying to get new clients, you will have to compete against the big firms and against the big agencies and against the big agents. So yes, it is a very, very consolidated market.
We know that the FIFA football agent regulations that have come on board have brought an exam, which means a lot of new agents. I think it's now over 8,000 in the world. And a lot of those, I think the 4th or 5th biggest number of agents sitting the exam are coming from Brazil. How has the FIFA football agent regulations affected the agency business in Brazil, in your opinion?
I'll try to understand this from a market perspective, not from a purely legal perspective. From a market perspective, I think it had a first positive effect in the sense that it is pushing away a little bit people that are not practicing or exercising agency on a regular basis. So family members, lawyers that are doing deals here and there, people that are gravitating around clubs and around players or even around agencies and are always trying to do some intermediation. I think that at this first moment, we felt a diminish on the numbers of people that are not practicing the agency on a regular basis in the market. But at the same time, it also leads us to an idea of even more concentration. So we can also feel that with the infrastructure that is required, not only passing the exams, but also keeping all the comprehension of the FIFA platform and all these things. Also, when it comes to work on double representation and how do you connect with other people, it became a lot more, I wouldn't say easier, but it's more, the big agencies and the big agents were already prepared for this new reality, while smaller agents and people that were gravitating around this business were not prepared, and it became very difficult for them to keep working. So I think that on a second effect, we will feel more and more concentration in this market.
Now, I mentioned the FIFA football agent regulations, the FFAR, and a day after, or a couple of days after, a very important ruling in England, which was the Rule K arbitration, a ruling about the agent regulations there, and more importantly, it affected the caps. In Brazil, there was a Rio de Janeiro court, I think it was the Seventh Civil Court, which made a decision on the FIFA football agent regulations. And in a ruling on the 18th of December 2023, that court suspended the 2023 football agent regulations, which were introduced by the Brazilian Football Confederation, or Federation CBF, which the aim was to transpose or incorporate FIFA's FFAR into national law. And I think the court in this decision said that there was conflicts with the Brazilian legislation in relation to the Brazilian Football Confederation regulations and the FFAR. What were the major findings of the court in this matter in terms of the FFAR and also the Brazilian football regulations that were being introduced?
My opinion here will be about someone that is interested about the case. So I know a little bit about the case, but of course I'm not directly involved in the case. The case was moved by the Brazilian Agents Association. And the main points of the case are that, first of all, it is a provisional decision. It is always important to highlight this. So it's not a definite ruling on the matter. But the decision found out that, first of all, the new FIFA regulations violated or potentially violate the Brazilian constitution when it comes to the principle of economic freedom. So the Brazilian constitution sets and protects the economic freedom as a principle, as a general principle. So there's a potential violation there, especially when it comes to requiring the license to carry on deals inside Brazil. So that was the parting point of the case. And then also there's a potential violation, if I'm not mistaken, on the Brazilian antitrust law as well. But of course, this is a more complex discussion. So more or less, it is an emulation of the same discussions that we had in Germany and in Spain, Belgium, and so on.
Now, all football markets are developing all the time with their own nuances and trends. Are there any specific things that agents from elsewhere should be aware of when working with the Brazilian market? And likewise, are there any notable new trends or clauses used by clubs emerging in Brazil?
I wouldn't say a trend itself, because it's not something that new, but it became more intense during the last few years. It is the income of foreigner workers into the Brazilian market. And when I say workers, I'm referring to, first of all, managers. So we have many successful Portuguese managers working in not only Portuguese, but we saw Jorge Sampaoli during the last few years working for Santos and other Brazilian clubs, Flamengo, Atlético Mineiro. But many Portuguese like Abel Ferreira with Palmeiras and Jorge Jesus, who is now in Hilal with a huge campaign with Flamengo in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So, of course, it opened doors to other projects like that, and it became more and more common, and it became a tendency. But then also, same thing followed with players. We had many players that were like playing on a European level for many years and came back to Brazil without a big salary drop. It's important to highlight that. And also the Brazilian market started looking for and started signing players that were not Brazilians and were playing on the European level. So we had Spanish players, for example, coming and playing in Brazil. And I think that this will become more and more common because there are many reasons for that. One of them is the new SAF law, the new law that allows clubs to turn into companies in Brazil, same thing that happened in England in the past and then Spain and Portugal. And this, of course, leads to a professionalization of the Brazilian clubs and the Brazilian market. And of course, clubs start looking into income generation on a more organized way, on a more stable way. Also, apart from all the problems in our economy and our politics, we are more or less stable, especially if you look into other competitors in the South American market. And this also helped clubs to work on a more long-term plan, on a more stable financial plan. So this is a tendency. Now it's also reaching to the sports executive level. For example, Flamengo just signed a Portuguese sports director last market. And this will get more and more intense. That's my feeling, at least, for the next few years. I think that if we're talking to other agents that are looking into the Brazilian market and are looking to do business in here, one of the key points is to understand the culture, because the culture is very unique and it is a very consolidated football culture. We've been doing this for many, many years. We were always an exporting market, so people here are very connected, they have the knowledge, and also we have our peculiarities that need to be understood, like when it comes to religion, when it comes to working mentality, when it comes to many other aspects that will influence on the decision taking and are important for ones that are looking into the Brazilian market from outside.
And obviously there, from what you said, Brazilian clubs are holding onto their talent a lot longer and able to pay those higher salaries and the transfer fees and such. But in terms of international markets, are there any newer or surprising regions that have emerged in recruiting Brazilian talent? And also, if I may ask, is there much need for Brazil to have an import market when it comes to playing talent, because the country produces so many talented players?
Those are two very good questions. First things first, yes, the landscape changed a lot during the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. In the past, for example, Serie A in Italy was like the main market, especially for the first move, because it was easier to adapt. There were similarities in the culture. So you had a lot of Brazilian players going on a very young age into Italy for big and smaller clubs, so they could adapt and then play in other European markets. Also, Germany in the past, we used to have like 10 to 15 Brazilians playing in Bundesliga, but because of some episodes and some things that happened, the understanding of the Brazilian player changed a lot, and the requirements, the bar was set much higher than it was in the past, especially when it comes to working mentality and things like that. And now you don't see that many Brazilian players playing in Bundesliga, for example. So it changed a lot. But at the same time, as you know better than me, we live on a very dynamic market. So, for example, until, let's say, 2-3 years ago, we are not doing that many deals with Russia anymore. But now with the war, the Russian clubs, when with all the barriers to make payments into Europe and things like that, Russian clubs came again for Brazilian talent, and they came with big budgets. So they're signing players that were potentially moving into other leagues. And these players are looking to move into Russia because the budget is very interesting. And also then you have like the taxation in Russia that is very low. So all aspects that can be taken in consideration for a player when they're looking into those markets. So yes, it's changing a lot. And then when we get to the second question, that is, if Brazil really needs to import talent, this is a big discussion that we're having now, especially about the coach of the Brazilian national team. Brazil just sacked the head coach of the Brazilian national team. And the 4 names that are being discussed are European coaches. I think they're talking about Ancelotti, they're talking about Jorge Jesus, they're talking about Abel Ferreira, and the 4th one, I don't recall now, but they talked about Pep in a certain moment. But my approach here is that we live on a very globalized market, and we cannot be arrogant in the sense that our players will take all positions here. We need people with different profiles. So, for example, it would be almost crazy to think of an Uruguayan player playing as a number 10 playmaker in a Brazilian main team. Nowadays, I think the best number 10 in Brazil is an Uruguayan player. So you never know where talent is, and I think that Brazilian clubs understood it. And also it's happening on the academy level. We had recently the case, and this is a very interesting case of a player called Richard Rios, who's Colombian playing for Palmeiras. And his agents are big friends of mine from Cala Sports. These guys scouted him playing futsal for Colombia at the age 17. So he came to play a futsal tournament for Colombia in Rio, and they scouted him and invited him to play futsal for Flamengo. And from the Flamengo futsal team, they transitioned him into the regular football team. And then he did, I think, 2 or 3 academy years in Flamengo. Flamengo didn't want to use him at the first team. He went to Mexico, didn't play much. Played 6 months a state league in São Paulo, and Palmeiras bought him. Last transfer market, Palmeiras received offers of, if I'm not mistaken, 15, 18, 25 million euros on this player. So you got to be open to these projects. You got to be open to players with other profiles, may it be physical, may it be focused on speed, may it be focused on the comprehension of the game, that sometimes some managers want some players with a different comprehension of the game. And again, I think that if you ask these 2 different people in the Brazilian market, they will have different opinions, but this is my approach.
And that global football market has seemingly got quite a bit bigger in recent years. And with the rise of the Saudi Pro League and the other non-European markets, how much impact has that had on the Brazilian market?
The relationship between Brazil and Saudi is also not a new one. Since the development of Saudi football during the 60s and 70s, we already had Brazilians working there, not only players, but also coaches and so on. What is happening now with Europeans already happened with the Brazilians to a certain extent. What happened is that the level got higher. So now we have younger players going to Saudi, and we have better players going to Saudi on a higher level. Even because now Saudi clubs are willing, and the league and all the project and everything are willing to pay the transfer fees. And of course, you cannot have younger players and like national team level players without paying transfer fee. These players are not free in the market. So this also is changing the landscape a little bit. We had a few interesting moves during the last markets. I can highlight 2 here. One of the Brazilian goalkeeper, Bento, who also plays for the Brazilian national team. And he came from Atlético Paranaense, first division, big team here in Brazil. And also Wesley from Palmeiras, I think he was 18 when he moved into Al Nassr as well. So yeah, it's changing a lot. And I think also it will get more intense during the next transfer markets.
I'm going to switch a bit now to a topic that's quite often misunderstood, and whether the football authorities like it or not, and whether or not it's permitted in the regulations. TPO, third-party ownership, TPI, third-party investment, still exists. And I think it's fair to say, arguably, it first emerged in Brazil. Are such aspects as prominent in the Brazilian market as they used to be? Or are they now more wrapped up in such things as complex sell-on clauses and commercial aspects?
It's undeniable that the prohibition changed the landscape a lot. You cannot say that people are doing TPO like they did in the past. It's not the same thing. Especially, again, we need to divide in different levels. When you come to first division and high level, clubs are much more focused on governance and other aspects. So it's not easy for you to put together a TPO structure or to circumvent the prohibitions and things like that. But yes, of course, it's a market thing. The market started working on other ways. I wouldn't say to circumvent, but to compensate the loss of such arrangements that you have in the past that were part of the remuneration scheme of an agent or an agency or an investor or a player himself or a member of the family. So yes, what I've seen is that the market works a lot with exclusivity clause on future selling and things like that. Now with the new regulations and no time limitation on the contract with the club, I've seen that some agents are not more focused on representing the player themselves, but having a relationship with the club. So yeah, this is changing. But if you go to a lower level, like second, third, fourth division, or in state leagues, it's more and more common because, again, the clubs have financial limitations and they have to be creative. And sometimes this creativity relies on what they know. And you still find like this kind of arrangements here and there. And yes, it's still a reality.
Luis, you mentioned culture, you mentioned religion, and you mentioned family as well. How much influence do players' families have in negotiations and decision-making within Brazilian football, and in particular in dealing with clubs and agents?
It's an interesting topic. I'll try not to make generalizations, but it is impossible to talk about such aspects without making generalizations. Of course, that you find people like Neymar's father who managed his career from a certain point and was very successful and delivers an example that this is possible. But at the same time, like working on an everyday basis, on a day-by-day basis in representation, you see that the opposite also happens and happens a lot more than what happened with Neymar's father. You have many family members trying to, I wouldn't say take advantage. Sometimes they have the legitimate intention to protect their kids, but some of them are clearly trying to take advantage on their kids and also on the agents. I was last year on an event in Portugal, in Lisbon, and we were discussing this on one of the questions of the panel. And one of the things that I raised there was that when I firstly read the new FIFA regulations, I was like, okay, the mention of the player protection is everywhere. It's a ratio that was used by FIFA on drafting the regulations. But who is going to protect the agents? Who is going to protect the agents against other agents? Who is going to protect agents against families and against players? Because again, the world has changed a lot and information is all around, especially inside football. These people that get into football with their kids on a very young age, they talk between each other. They listen to a lot of things. Sometimes of course, they build fantasies around it. But the fact is that they have a lot of information. So when they come to sign representation agreements, most of the times, especially in Brazil, they come already with the idea of asking for money. And they even they try to bail from different agents. So they listen to offers from different agencies and from different agents and things like that. It's forbidden, but it's a cultural thing that sometimes, even when you don't do it, it's a problem that you face because it's there. It's part of the culture and it's difficult to move them from this. But yes, they play a good part. They play a big role in the sense, not only fathers, but mothers, wives, and vice versa when we are talking about female players. And for me, this is one of the biggest problems of our football in this moment, because again, you have good examples, but you have a lot of bad ones. And I've seen some players that synced with a lot of talent and could have done a lot better. But in the end, there was a process of building an expectation that in the end was disconnected from the reality of what they could be. And it didn't mean that they could not play on a good level, but the expectation was too high and the demands were too high. And it's ended up, of course, messing with the career planning and the build of our winning mentality.
You mentioned there's quite a few challenges. The FFAR's a little bit, as you said, player focused. The agent still has a lot of challenges in dealing with other agents. And we know the chamber, as in the agents chamber, the international one, FIFA's, has been suspended. So agents don't have any ability to take action there. But in terms of the Brazilian market, what are the main challenges that licensed football agents face in the Brazilian football market, such as trying to enforce contracts or secure commission payments from either clubs or players?
I think I see three main challenges, but again, it depends a lot on the level that you're talking about or you're working. For bigger agencies, I think that the biggest challenge is competition. There's a lot of competition. Even if we're talking about a very stable market that is taken by, let's say, 10 agencies or agents, there's even competition between them. So they are always competing for talent and for players. Depending on the call for the Brazilian national team, one of these agencies have, let's say, 10 players, another one has 8, and it changes as, of course, the scenario changes. So competition is one of them. There's a lot of dispute. If we go to other markets, I don't see this happening that much. I also do some work in Spain, and I represent some players there, and I don't see this as savage as it is in Brazil, as strong as it is. And we have good people. It's not people that are not qualified or experienced or something like that. You're playing against good players. And then second, I think that the families, the point that you raised on the last question, is one of the biggest challenges. I think that families need to understand and need to find professionals that can carry on the management of the careers of their kids and not to intervene. They can participate to a certain level, they can be informed, but when they start to get to the club offices and attending to meetings and trying to influence on some decisions, I think that this is when it becomes very, very problematic. And then if you go to a lower level, that's where the third problem arises. I think that usually the clubs are very strong entities in Brazil, like it is everywhere. And if you're a smaller agent working, let's say, with 10 players on a lower level, trying to raise one of your players, if you don't have a big infrastructure, if you're not connected inside, it's very difficult for you to keep your player, because this point will be connected with the competition one. So the big agencies will come for your players, and in the end, you'll have much more conditions to take the player away from you.
Yes, that happens in a lot of countries, the smaller agents. We've seen the emergence of big agencies, not just in Brazil, across the board, and it's getting harder for the newer agents or the smaller agents to compete in that space, unless obviously they've got a very good portfolio of players. I want to talk briefly about international agent associations and football lawyers or sports lawyers. Now, we've seen a lot of international agent associations. We've seen the TFF, we've seen PROFA, we've seen a new organization called IFA that's emerged, and there's several others, there's also some based in Europe. And we've also seen the emergence of football or sports lawyers who are really involved a lot in deals, for helping agents navigate deals across different markets. Has the Brazilian market or the agents, how do they see these international associations and also the role of sports lawyers in the space when negotiating deals for players or when dealing with clubs?
No, for me, it's a little bit tricky to talk about lawyers, because this was my pathway into the industry. I started to be a partner of an agency and to represent players. But again, if you go back in time, this is not something new. If you remember, before the deregulation in FIFA, lawyers were automatically authorized to sign deals and to carry on transfers and to represent players on their contracts. So it started back then. And again, we can't make generalizations, but we have a handful of, especially in Brazil, lawyers that are international players in this market because of the characteristics of our market. There in the beginning of the 90s or mid-90s, when we became an exporting market, some of these guys or some of these girls, they were already in the market. They were representing players or they were related to a club. And then they started advising agents and players themselves. And they've been there since then. And of course that they got contacts, and of course that they got knowledge, and of course that they can carry on deals. And this happens. This happens a lot. I'm not against it. I think that in the end, it's up to the client to choose whoever he wants to work with or she wants to work with. But at the same time, I have to recognize that myself, I have to make a big effort to change my lawyer skin into my agent's skin every time I speak to players, every time I speak to clubs, because it's a completely different thing. It's a completely different thing, and the language is different. Understanding the client is completely different. The way you negotiate is completely different. So I think that at the same time, there are pros and cons in having lawyers involved in transfers. And I see like ones that are doing this really good and others that are try to do so, but they don't succeed because, again, they do not understand that it's a completely different activity. In regards to the associations, I don't see them as active in Brazil, apart from the case that we just discussed, the Rio de Janeiro case that suspended the application of the FIFA regulations. But they are not like very present in the market, because in a very competitive environment, it's difficult to put people together on the table and to make them discuss common interests and points of tangency that they have between them. It's a bit hard.
One final question, Luis, and really thank you for your time. You mentioned a little bit the characteristics of the Brazilian football market, the way the clubs, the players, and now it's become an import market. It's bringing in a lot of players, and even from Africa, some talent from there, but obviously Argentina, Uruguay, you mentioned Spain and Colombia. What advice would you give to international football agents when dealing with Brazilian agents and navigating the Brazilian player markets? Is there any other pieces of advice that you think are essential for international agents to note and understand how to deal with the dynamics of the Brazilian market, and including dealing with Brazilian football agents?
I know that I mentioned this several times, but I would focus on the cultural understanding of the markets and of the Brazilian football culture as well, because it plays a big role in the end on the decision making. I've worked on cross-border collaborations with many agents from different places, from different cultures. And sometimes it's a bit difficult for them to understand what in the end, how do we accommodate the family? How do we deal with different clubs? How does the player changes his mind throughout the way? And we need to be very cautious about that and very careful about that. How does the club changes its position? And again, it appears to be the same thing, like the same business, same transfer, same contract. But in the end, all these cultural idiosyncrasies play a big role on decision making on all sides involved on a contract or a transfer or a collaboration. And for me, it's important. So if we're talking about international agents looking to work more in Brazil or to improve their presence in Brazil, I would strongly recommend them to come here, spend some time, travel around, knowing different levels, know where the players come from, what is their background, what is the reality, understanding a little bit about the religion that also plays a big role, depending. There are players that are very into religion, and this in the end also it's a factor of decision. For example, one of my players called me 2 weeks ago, called to me and Naldo, who is my partner at N29, and it's the face of the company actually. And the player told us something like this: look, I would like to go to US because there in the US, my church has presence there. And of course, that we try to accommodate the players the best we can, but we also try to make him understand, look, you have a brighter future in our opinion. You're a player that is prepared to play in Europe. You're getting your double nationality. That this is something that we focus on our agency. We work mostly with players that can play in Europe without occupy the foreigner's place. So this is the perfect example on how you need to understand them and how can you work these things around. And if you come from outside with a very objective mentality of closing a deal, sometimes it can be a bit frustrating.
Luis, thank you for your time. Thank you for these amazing insights. It's fantastic. The Brazilian market's always intrigued a lot of agents and also a lot of our listeners. You really broke it down very well in different themes and questions, and your experience just is unbelievable. Really, thank you for coming on the Agents Angle.
No, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Peter. It's a big pleasure. And again, I became a big listener of the podcast, and it's important to have people doing what you're doing because, again, we don't have much good content about what we do. And it is good to discuss, to have different opinions, to understand what are the tools, what are the different situations that we have in different markets, especially with the new regulations. And so we need people representing and discussing our topics the best we can. So again, my pleasure.
That was an excellent interview with Luis. He is at the top of the Brazilian football law and football agency space. He has a huge wealth of knowledge, experience, insights, and as he mentioned in the interview, involved in many premier deals pertaining to the Brazilian transfer market, both in and out. Very interested to see some of the idiosyncrasies of the Brazilian agency market. He mentioned family, mentioned religion, but also, just like other big leagues or big countries, there are maybe 10 big agencies that are mainly doing a lot of the deals in Brazil. So it's a very concentrated market. And also, as we know from other territories, there are clubs that have preference of dealing with agents on who they know. So Brazil's a big country, so I understand why certain clubs would deal with certain preferred agents. It's a bit like the USA, where the geography is so big, it's very hard for maybe smaller agents or agencies to dominate where, you've got Rio, you've got Sao Paulo, you've got Fortaleza, you've got Recife, you've got so many different cities that an agent without a big agency presence cannot control all those markets or all those players. So very interesting observations by Luis.
Yes, we've had the privilege of having some great guests and great interviews over the 2 seasons of the Agents Angle, but I think Luis is well up there as one of the best and most informative. Fantastic insights, fantastic technical knowledge, brilliant real-world examples, and a lot of practical aspects that hopefully people can reflect on, learn from, if not even apply them. And this probably goes to show why really top players like Thiago Silva, who've had such long and successful careers, trust the likes of Luis throughout those careers.
Yes, that's right. And there's some big players, and he's also involved in some deals in the bigger leagues in Europe. But I had a look at some of the best represented agencies in Serie A in Brazil, just to see who some of these agencies are. And just to mention some names: Link Sports, Bertolucci Sports, Talent Sports, Casa Soccer M9, and there is one US-based agency, Rock Nation Sports, who I believe bought a Brazilian agency. I also looked at whether Brazilian agents have a bigger impact on one of the biggest competitions, the CONMEBOL Libertadores, and whether some of their football agencies are involved with players there. And Link Sports comes up, as does Bertolucci Sports. But the leading one is an American agency, Vibra Football, and a Paraguayan, maybe because that's the number of players, Eagle Eye. And in terms of Argentina, which is a fascinating market, I'll just mention Hernan Berman being the largest agent from that market, controlling players in the CONMEBOL Libertadores competition.
But we're going to switch a bit here from one big football market to another. Let's swap the land of Pele, Christ the Redeemer and Copacabana Beach for Bobby Moore, Buckingham Palace and Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Yes, England. Now, in the last week, again at the time of recording, because as we've said, we're recording this quite a bit earlier than usual, the FA, the English Football Association, released their annual reports relating to agent commissions and transactions across the English leagues, not least the English Premier League. And I used to go through these reports line by line in the past to highlight any anomalies and patterns, as did a respective football law colleague of mine. Hi, Dan, if you're listening. Even to the point the FA used to give us a heads up when the reports would be released, if only to stop us pestering them. And generally, from year to year, the reports have changed slightly. And despite the FA's best efforts, the information is still hugely open to a large amount of interpretation, if not misinterpretation and skew. And I think even the FA accept that a bit. In fact, I've often said you can tell more from what information is seemingly missing from these reports when cross-checking it with certain players or clubs listed. But there is a very interesting change this year, which must be in light of the FFAR being introduced. And that is the inclusion of not just the agents acting for players and clubs, but also this year's report, the agents acting for managers, coaches, and coaching staff, including a couple of set-piece coaches for whom I recognise the names in there. And yes, in terms of actual financial figures, this could add to the skew. And maybe in the future, the FA will separate off player agent commissions from that of coaches agents commissions, but that hasn't happened with agents representing clubs, so I don't think it will happen anytime soon. But that aside, for the first time, the real football data buffs, analysts, academics, and part-time detectives can try and start to join up the dots as to which agents may influence which coaches and vice versa, and then subsequently, which clubs, players, if not even club officials, connect various agents, agencies, and other parties as well. But this is nothing on what may be possible next year with 2 years of reports, as there are already several coaches listed in these reports that are now either out of work or have even been sacked and got another job since. And given that the average tenure of a Premier League manager tends to be around about the 2-year mark, next year's reports could uncover some really interesting patterns.
Very interesting observations regarding the coach and client angle for agents, Jonathan. It's new information, and as you say, as that information collates and into the second year, there's a lot of different angles to that information that anyone can take to see how many coaches are controlled by certain agencies and the players they have in those teams. So, as you say, transactions involving coaches are newly included in relation to this report. Some of the key points about the report content, just some general observations. This report is about total payments made by clubs to FA registered football agents, so English Football Association registered football agents. They list all transactions for players, we mentioned coaches, but also on behalf of clubs with FA registered agents. There's a bit of an expanded scope. For the first time, we've got the Women's Super League in England and the Women's Championship clubs are included. And there's a bit of a timing note that should be aware of with this report. Payments may relate to deals made before the current reporting period, because a lot of times agents get paid in installments. Therefore, payment totals per club might not directly match listed transactions. Finally, the great thing about some takeaways here is the FA is increasing transparency and inclusivity by, obviously, as you mentioned, reporting coaching deals and women's football deals. And also, I would say with these sort of payment figures, we're getting a better financial flow involving agents, but we also know that not always all this information always corresponds with current period of transactions. So there's sometimes an anomaly there, but we're getting better insights, Jonathan.
Now, call me a little bit sad, but I enjoy scrutinising these reports and similar ones from other countries. Maybe not as much as I used to, but one thing that has always infuriated me for many years is the press and media coverage that comes with them. And in some cases, I think they use the same article year on year and just change the figures, with the old and very tired mantra of agents taking money out of the game. And some journalists, not all, I hasten to add, really skew these reports and take things out of context, whether deliberately or not. Some accentuate and dramatise the language, and I have just a few here from this week. We've got staggering, splurging, huge, clubs being hit in the pocket, eye-popping, and dwarfed by being just a few that have been used. And this really pees me off because it's really cheap journalism. And I love good sports journalism that looks beyond scores, speculation, and sensationalism. But this year, I think in general, the media may have toned down that mantra a little bit. And maybe that is because, firstly, the FA took the time to stress a bit more context when releasing the reports. As you said, payments may be associated with transactions that happened a few years ago, or the fact that some of the figures paid by some of the biggest English clubs, the agent commission figures, are down on last year, according to these reports, such as Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea, Manchester United, Arsenal, and Tottenham. But amongst this reported annual outrage over agent commissions generated by these FA reports, one report on this matter stood out for me this week because it was an article by a journalist who, whilst giving factual figures, in my opinion, he actually went out of his way to present some context very well, and even went some way to specify that these commissions covered licensed agents, something so many in the media continue to miss and lump all agents in together. And it wasn't a big media outlet, just a local one, but credit where credit's due. So Luke Cordell at Kent Online, take a bow for actually trying to give some context on this matter, rather than seeking to sensationalize things.
Yes, I think I'll go into what Ken Online went through, but I just want to go to some key points and key takeaways of some of this information. And we had a look at several articles, not just covering the English Premier League, but the Championship and the lower leagues, and obviously a lot of the EPL clubs, English Premier League clubs. Now, overall spending is down slightly, as you mentioned. Some of the clubs, you mentioned Chelsea, they remained at the top of the chart, spending over £60.4 million in agent fees, but that's a reduction of 20%. But that covers 44 player agents or player representatives, and with 26 of those players yet to make their first team debut, and also an agent fee for the former manager Mauricio Pochettino. All big six clubs reduced their agent fees, but also we've seen increases by some clubs in agent fees. Aston Villa, Brentford, Brighton, Crystal Palace, Fulham, Newcastle, West Ham, and your club, Wolverhampton or Wolves, increased their spending to agents in this last period. So that's an interesting correlation. And I would say maybe the big clubs are tightening their spending on agents or cutting costs. Maybe it's a broader reflection of more disciplined financial management within the top tier. But then if you're more at the relegation side, you want to make sure that you get the right players. So it may be more expensive. And we mentioned women's football. Chelsea's women were the top spenders with over £600,000 spent on agents, double the next highest club. But I want to go into the lower leagues a little bit, very briefly, if you allow me, Jonathan. An interesting club, Gillingham, League Two, spent over £200,000 on agent fees over the last 12 months. Only Fleetwood Town and Port Vale spent more. But Gillingham hardly spent any money on agents, and all of a sudden they are spending big. So that's an interesting dichotomy now that they've moved over to spending more money on agents. It marks a major financial shift. Maybe they got new leadership, greater investment in players and agents. So it's interesting how that data sort of reflected. I will go into the Championship because that is probably one of the most competitive leagues in the world. And very briefly, I had a look at the top 10 agencies acting in the Championship. And it's the big agents. I would have thought it would be smaller agents doing a lot of the deals, but the most players represented in the EFL Championship is Wasserman, Unique Sports, CA Stella, CA Base, and Refuel Performance. And then you've got World in Motion we know about. So that shows that the big agencies are still involved in the lower tier. It's not just the Premier League. But interesting in these articles that we looked at or through the report, is the improvement of Nottingham Forest. They spent nearly $13 million on agent fees over the last two transfer windows. And you can see that improvement of new players and a big improvement in that regard. So this report is very interesting for me because it shows league-wide trends. I mentioned League Two. I mentioned the Championship. The overall agent fee landscape shows a slight decline in spending at the top level, though significant investment does remain. However, that's more among clubs either aiming for promotion or avoiding relegation. So that is pretty much what I see there. But a very interesting report, Jonathan, and one that I think every agent should have a look at, not just because who's doing the deals, but also the trends up and down across the English pyramid. Now, you mentioned I am off to Europe this Easter weekend, so I hope to meet some agent colleagues, including yourself, Jonathan, in person. I'm coming past London, but I've got a few announcements. Firstly, a couple of conferences. The Future of Football Conference is happening on 11 May, and it's a conference that's in Spain, the Costa Brava. So there's a full speaker lineup and agenda coming for that conference. It relates to the IFAM International Conference. IFAM do a lot of sports moots, but here they've decided to also do a Future of Football Conference. There's another conference, the International Sports Lawyers Conference 2025 in Berlin, November. A lot of football lawyers will be attending that, especially lawyer agent types. And another interesting conference is in Zanzibar in Africa, International Women in Sports Empowerment Conference, 15th of June, so not too far away. And it's good to see in Africa a lot more sport conferences, especially in football, being promoted. And this conference is about empowering women in sports, athletes, coaches, agents, administrators, policymakers. So some very interesting conferences, not just in Europe, but elsewhere as well. That's it from me. Today, we've had a fantastic guest, as we always do. And I think a guest that nearly anyone interested in not just Brazilian football, but world football should listen to. Thank you for listening. Bye from me.
So whilst Peter is off jet-setting and schmoozing with no doubt many of the key figures across the European and Asian football scene, not least the star of the football mediation world, mentioning no names, of course, we will, of course, be keeping our eyes on the latest developments from across the football agency world and trying to keep you up to date with all of them on his return. And whilst we await the Advocate General's opinion on the football agent-related cases at the ECJ, I reiterate it is only one additional week we have to wait in a saga that has lasted for several years. So to use an age-old British mantra, don't panic. Well, not just yet anyway. Take care, everyone, and bye for now.
The purpose of the Agent's Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.